But obviously, after I did the show for a while, I realized that the show was successful, and that this particular character, Quentin, you know, you began to have a feeling of, or a wonderment of, because that was the nature of the beast, I think, is this character getting across to the people who are watching it? Are they going to like him? And then it becomes, are they going to like me? You start taking it all personally. Then a lot of letters started coming into the studio. I mean, just tons of letters. I mean, thousands of letters for Quentin and as such, David Selby, who was playing the role. So many, in fact, that I found I was overwhelmed by that. And they didn't even give them to me. I mean, they just, I remember seeing tons of boxes and boxes full. And I began to sense that, oh my goodness, the character was getting successful. And about that time, I think my contract had been up, and Dan just, was renewing it. So then I knew that, oh, hey. And of course, then 16 Magazine came in. And when 16 Magazine, Gloria Stavers came aboard and started taking so many pictures and calling me, and I started doing all of this publicity for the show via 16 Magazine and all that. Then I began to realize that because they told me, basically, that a lot of fans, that the character had, that Quentin had a lot of fans across the country. And that was, I must say, that was quite special. And I can't say that I didn't enjoy that. I did very much so. I enjoyed, enjoyed that. I mean, who wouldn't in that sense? So that was all quite good. And the fact that the storyline, going back to the past and all of that, was quite significant rating-wise, was also, you know, good. Not just for me personally, but it was a rewarding time to do that and to realize that people were turning in to watch. And then that when you walked outside the studio, you'd always have a whole contingent of fans watching you, and all of that was new. And then I'd go home. I lived in a one-bedroom, two-room apartment up on 74th Street in the West Side at that time. And I would go and do these things like, I Am an American Day Parade in New York, or I'd appear here, or I remember traveling up, I believe, to Boston or Maine, somewhere up in there, and doing various things at that time, and even going out in public, going to a theater. I remember going to see, was it Cabaret or some show back during that time, and walking into the theater, it was a Broadway house, and literally people applauding. And you have that total ignorance of what's going on, and then you realize, and then you just are embarrassed, and then, but after you leave or whatever, you're sort of saying, gee whiz, that's all right, and then you go home to your two-room apartment, and there's something wrong with this picture here, and I should, you know, that's so there was all of that, and it took a while. And then, of course, your parents back home, and all of your relatives and your friends, and of course, I heard from a lot of them, and I can imagine that during that particular time that they'd watch it, and they'd probably are saying, "Oh my God, do you know who that is?" and that whole thing. So there was a sense of joy about all of that. I can recall having, you know, people were always jumping into cabs with me. You know, I'd be forced to take a cab. I didn't live too far from the studio at that time, but the fans were so voracious or whatever, exuberant, and just loved to walk with you or whatever. And if you would I can remember hopping into the cab and having 3 or 4 jumping into the cab with me, you know, and then I'd, you know, or walking home, it was like a Pied Piper. And I actually had a few actually asked that camped out in the lobby of my little building, and I just had lived in a brownstone, so it wasn't any great lobby or anything like that, but they had asked me to, if I would adopt them. And that was true, and so we had to call the family court and do things like that. And of course, I remember mentioning one of the things, and I've mentioned this before, some of the things that it was of its time. And it was the late 60s, during that time, 68, 69, 70. And I got so many peace beads, thousands of peace beads, and I wondered, I should have kept them, but I gave everything, I gave all those gifts away, and I could remember, they gave you just such, some were quite simple, but some were elaborate or whatever, but they were all of that period of the late 60s. And I remember, and I've mentioned this before, I happened to mention that I liked Sara Lee banana cake, somewhere in 16 magazine, I believe, or one of those magazines. There was Tiger Bee, there were several. And ABC at that time, we were bombarded with Sara Lee banana cakes. It just would start. So all that, and I used to get tons of stuffed animals. I loved that, and I would take them up. At that time, there was a housing up at Lincoln Center, the Lincoln Center complex up in there. You could take things up there, and I donated all of that. I constantly taking loads of things up there like that. It was all delightful. The sideburns, I have no idea whose initial idea that was, whether it could have been Dan's for all I know. It could have been Vinny, the makeup man, or I don't know where the initial idea came from. Maybe I had a thought about mutton chops, but we had these two sort of obviously fake mutton chops, and I was trying to grow my own real ones under that. So we'd go in, Vinny would glue these mutton chops onto my beard that I was growing, and every day having to pull that. But eventually I was able to grow enough, and we could pencil it in a little bit. I never was able to grow a great beard anyway, but those turned out, and so I eventually grew my own, and I was amazed at the number of people around the country who would write, and as letters I read, that they had grown their mutton chops too, and I sort of like that, or women who had named their babies Quentin. So that was all right, but I kept those. Then I had to cut them again because I started doing a lot of theater. So, and then I had to go back to, but anyway.